The shelves in the back, or the saw side of the outfeed table, are going to be 47¼ inches long, and they're going to be made out of plywood. And even though I added a set of shelf pin holes in the middle of the back panel, we want to do something to make sure those shelves don't sag. Also, since the outfeed table's going to be being moved around in my shop quite a bit, I'd like to have a lip on the front edge of the shelves so that nothing falls off. To accomplish this, I'm going to make some trim for the front edge of the plywood that'll serve as both a stiffener and as a lip. Now, the first step was easy. I just cut up some of my leftover pieces of walnut. I found 3 pieces 3/4 of an inch thick. I cut them to a little over 48 inches long and then ripped them to 1.5 inches wide. We'll trim them to the final length a little bit later. Okay, to make this trim piece for the edge of the shelves that will serve as a stiffener and a lip, basically what we're going to do is we're going to cut a rabbet in this trim piece that will fit over the edge of the plywood. Now, to do that, I'm going to make it in 2 cuts on the table saw. We're going to cut one side of the rabbet, then cut the other side away. To make the first cut, I've set the inside edge of this blade 3/8 of an inch from the fence, meaning that the thickness of the blade and everything else will be on the waist side of the cut. To set the height, which I want to be the same as the thickness of the plywood, is actually very easy. Just take 2 scraps of the same plywood that you're using for the shelves, put one down, put the other on top, and when the blade is just touching that top piece, the depth is correct. So let's make this cut. Okay, the next step is to cut away the waste. Make the second cut and form our rabbet. So what I've done is I've set up the blade lined up with this cut so it cuts just the waist. I've lowered it to 3/8 of an inch so it doesn't cut into this other piece, and I think we're ready to go. Now, the key on these types of cuts is to make sure that your offcut, your waist piece, is away from the fence so it has a place to go and you don't risk any kickback. Well, you've certainly seen me cut plywood on the SawStop before. You don't really need to see that again, but just a couple of things here. First of all, the width of the shelves will be 6 1/8 because the trim piece is 3/8 of an inch thick, the part we left on the rabbet, which will make the total shelf width 6.5 inches. The other thing I wanted to point out is before you catch it and say, oh Steve, you ran the grain direction the wrong way. And from an appearance standpoint, that'll be correct. The grain is running this way, but I'm going to cut the shelves this way. And the reason for that is because this so-called cabinet grade plywood is just 5 plies. And 3 of the plies run opposite from the face grain veneer plies. So that will give the shelf more strength even though it may not look conventional. With the glue dry, I was able to use the crosscut sled and trim one clean end and then cut the shelf to 47¼ inches to fit in this space in the back. And I think this is going to be pretty nice. For our drawers, we're going to make a simple but nifty little joint that we can make exclusively on the table saw. Let's take a look. Using the dado stack, we're going to make 2 cuts for each joint. One is a rabbet in the front and back pieces of the drawer boxes, and the other is a matching dado in the 2 side pieces for each box. You know, with ball bearing shelf slides like we're going to be using in the outfeed table, the tolerances for side to side dimensions for a drawer box are really very tight. We can be +0, meaning we can't be over in that dimension at all. And we can only be -1/32 of an inch in the overall width of the drawer box, or it just won't work. So the 2 most critical dimensions here are the width of this rabbet and the depth of this matching dado. A little tricky to set up, especially with plywood that's not really a full 1/2 inch thick. But once it's set, it'll be pretty easy to make all the drawers quickly. First, though, while we have the regular blade in the SawStop, let's cut all the drawer box parts to size. Alright, so the height of the drawer boxes is 5¼ inches. So I've broken down some pieces of plywood into manageable sizes. I've set the fence for 5¼ inch cut, and I'm just going to cut a whole bunch of strips to get ready to start making the drawers. The critical part of this particular cut is actually twofold. This rabbet needs to be exactly 1/4 inch from the outside edge into the ledge. And the piece that's remaining, let's call it the tongue, needs to be exactly 1/4 inch thick. So after setting up the dado stack, which I set up for 1/4 inch thickness, which is just the 2 outside blades of the dado stack, I installed this sacrificial fence and started to adjust the fence location. I made a couple of test cuts until I got this dimension to exactly 1/4 inch. Then I went to work on the height of the blade so as to leave this 1/4 inch here. Now this is undersized 1/2 inch plywood, so the height of the blade is actually a little less than 1/4 inch, more like 7/32. Well, it took me a couple of test cuts, but I got it to where this thickness, tested with the micrometer, is exactly 1/4 inch. So I think we're pretty much ready to go. We're going to cut all the drawer fronts and the backs at the same time, and then we'll switch over and we'll start cutting the side pieces. Okay, now with all the rabbets cut, the next step is to cut this dado in the side pieces. And of course, just like this was set 7/32 inch high, that's what we need to do, is to cut 7/32 inch from the edge. And since we made this exactly 1/4 inch, we're going to need to raise the height of the blade just a smidge. Now, getting 7/32 inch away from this is going to be tricky, so we'll just have to run a few tests. All right, let's run a test cut there, and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, the distance is pretty good, but I need to raise that blade up a little bit because I've got just a little bit of gap there. So I'm going to raise that blade up just a little tiny bit, and we'll make another test cut. Now, that blade still needs to come up just a little bit. That's near about perfect. I think we've got it. Let's put together a drawer and see what it looks like. All right, well, let's take a look now and see how this is going to go together before we start going crazy here making cuts. Make sure everything's going to fit right. Well, that fit pretty good. Let's get this piece in. Oops. Better if I turned it the right way, huh? Well, it fits snugly. Get that one started. And there we go. That fits pretty good. All right, I think that's going to make a pretty decent drawer. Well, I've got all these drawers just dry fit together, no glue, but I'm going to label them and make sure I keep them in the same orientation because I kind of like the way they're shaping up and looking. This is a pretty big drawer here that's going to go on the bottom. It'll be great for a crosscut sled, but I'm going to need to find something pretty stiff, pretty heavy to go in the bottom of this to make the bottom of the drawer. I'm going to go take a look for that now and be back in just a few minutes. All right, I went out to my lumber storage area and I was able to scrounge enough leftover hardboard to cut the bottoms for these shelves. Now this happens to be 3/16 of an inch thick hardboard, and I've cut those to size. And here's how I got the size. I want to set this hardboard into grooves in the side of the drawer box that are 3/16 of an inch deep. So 3/16 inch on each side. If you double that, that's 3/8 of an inch. So all I did was take this dimension and add 3/8, and take this dimension and add 3/8, and it should fit just fine. So what we need to do now is we need to cut the grooves. I want to set the grooves about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the drawer side, and we're just going to make it with the regular saw blade to 2 passes. The first pass should cut it just right exactly at 1/8 of an inch, and then I'll just widen it a little bit with the second pass and we'll be good to go. And the last thing that I've done here is I've taken some chalk and I've marked some lines around here indicating the edge and side that the groove goes on, because now that the drawers are made, I sure wouldn't want to mess up and cut those grooves in the wrong place. So I think we're good to go. I just need to set the fence and the blade height and we'll start cutting those grooves. Okay, we just want to make sure that we put the grooves where I put this chalk line here, and we're going to run 1 pass and then we'll move the fence a little bit and widen the groove. Since I have this first setup here and I've cut the first groove, I'm going to go ahead and make some test boards that I can use getting the next cut set just right. All right, now what I've done, since the blade is 1/8 of an inch thick, so our first cut was 1/8 of an inch, I've moved the fence over 1/16 of an inch to widen that. Now should be 3/16 of an inch. Actually, I bumped it maybe an extra 1/64. So let's just see how this works. You can see all we did here was widen this groove, and we just need to see if it's going to fit. That's actually pretty good. Okay, my sequence for glue up for these drawers is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to start with the longer piece, put a little glue in this groove. I'm going to put some glue in these joints here and in this groove, and I'm going to put these 3 pieces together. I'm going to stand it up, slide the panel in, and then glue the last piece in. Alright, after I got the glue on and got the drawer assembled and clamped up, I actually moved these clamps down to the side. And I did that just so I could access the corners easily and measure corner to corner and make sure the dimensions matched to assure that we were perfectly square. Now the other thing you want to do on a large drawer like that is these side pieces where the ball bearing slides are going to be mounted need to be perfectly straight and parallel to one another. And sometimes on a large drawer, when you clamp the corners, these pieces of plywood on the side can bow or bend a little bit. Easiest way to check that is just measure the outside dimension end to end right near the joint, and then measure it in the middle. And then measure it at the other joint. And as long as those dimensions all match, then your plywood has not bowed and the sides are parallel with one another. So we're good to go. I'm going to let this set up for a little bit and then we'll assemble the small drawers. Well, the drawers are all glued up and they're in the clamps, just waiting for the glue to set up a little. Now's as good a time as any to go take a coffee break. I know that's what I'm going to do. When you get back, be sure and click on segment 6B and we'll wrap this project up.